The slider gauge hit the obsidian podium and rang like a struck bell. Nobody in the obsidian concourse had expected a sound like that. 300 species sat behind curved volcanic glass in concentric arcs, and every one of them went still. Executor Zeakul, 7 feet of crystalline violet skin and pressurized silence, let the echo die before he looked down at the thing Commander Clara Lynn had placed between them. It was old iron, heavy, notched, scratched at one edge where someone had filed a calibration mark by hand. Not a weapon, not a data chip, not a formal counterproposal stamped with the seal of the Terran Admiralty. Just iron. Lynn's right thumb was already off the ring she wore. She'd been slowly turning it around her thumb through the whole reading of the decree, and now it sat still on her hand. She pulled her fingers back from the gauge and stepped away from the podium without looking at Zeakul again. "You can keep the paperwork, Legate," she said. "We're done here. Stay close. What happened in that chamber is only the beginning of what humanity decided to do, and the part that still wakes me up is what came after the silence." 12 hours earlier, the decree had not yet been spoken aloud. The obsidian concourse was filling with the low vibration of 420 delegations arranging themselves in precedence order, the kind of procedural choreography that had been running on the same script for 600 years. The chamber floated inside the hollowed core of a dead moon, its ceiling lost in darkness 300 meters above the floor, its walls lined with obsidian panels that had absorbed and re-radiated the light of more political executions than any species in attendance kept official records of. Commander Clara Lynn sat in the human delegation chair, one chair, no second seat, and read the day's procedural calendar on a folded paper printout. Not a slate, not a projected grid. Paper, the way she always read working documents, printed that morning aboard the UNS Dauntless in the outer anchorage. She had a half cup of water at her left hand that she hadn't touched. The ring on her right thumb was still. Zeakul arrived from the high dais at the formal hour. His 4 elongated skeletal fingers on each hand rested flat on the speaking rail. His crystalline skin sat at a deep violet in the pressurized atmosphere of the chamber, and he spoke softly, the way he always spoke, in a series of pressurized clicks that the translation array rendered as a smooth, quiet tenor. "The High Assembly of Sovereignties," Zeakul said, "in formal session, pursuant to the administrative integration codes governing systemic infrastructure within the recognized galactic volume, hereby declares all human-engineered hyperspace transit matrices operating within the 7th sector to be designated systemic infrastructure of galactic scope." He paused, not for drama. He simply waited for the translation delay to clear. "Quantum navigation keys governing those matrices are to be surrendered to the Assembly Technical Directorate by sunset of this session. Administrative partnership status is extended to the Terran Compact as a transitional courtesy." He smiled thinly. The crystalline sheen on his jaw shifted toward obsidian. Lynn looked up from her paper. "Let me be sure I understand the offer," she said. Her voice was level. Not loud, not shaking level, the way a reading on a gauge is level. "You're declaring our transit nodes to be your infrastructure and offering us a partnership in return for the keys to what we built." "The Assembly recognizes the contribution of Terran engineers to the current configuration of the grid," Zeakul said. "The transitional partnership acknowledges that history." "That's generous," Lynn said. She stood up, picked up her paper printout, folded it once, and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she reached into the case she'd carried in under her left arm and set the iron gauge on the obsidian podium. The ring, the sound. "This tool doesn't look at law books, Legate," Lynn said. "It looks at tension." She left the gauge on the stone. "You've taken our paperwork. Now you have the keys. The rest is yours." She walked out through the high side doors before the formal vote count began. No member of the human delegation remained to hear the result. The Assembly registered the decree as passed by a margin of 414 to 0, with 6 abstentions from species that had not yet figured out which way the current was running. Zia Kull looked at the iron gauge for a long moment. Then he had it removed from the podium and catalogued as a surrendered instrument. He did not know what it measured. He did not ask. That was the first wrong decision. It would not be the last. The UNS Dauntless was 30,000 kilometers off the outer anchorage when Lynn returned to the bridge. Her comms officer, a compact man named Reyes, who had served with her through 3 frontier assignments, watched her walk in and said nothing. He'd heard the vote result on the open assembly feed. "Get me a line to Sovereign Dusk," Lynn said. She sat down, picked up the mug of cold coffee from the command rail, and took a sip. "Already waiting on your authorization," Reyes said. "Authorize it." That was all. Reyes keyed the command, and the transmission went out across a pre-established, unlogged frequency to every human facility manager in the 7th sector, all 4,112 of them. The message was 3 words and a timestamp. "Begin, Sovereign Dusk." Lynn set the mug down and unfolded her paper printout again. The Assembly's decree was printed at the top in clean block type. She read it through one more time, then set it aside and pulled the duty roster for the Dauntless instead. Outside, across a volume of space that would take a standard vessel 11 days to cross at maximum slipstream, 300,000 human engineers read the same timestamp and began shutting down their workstations. Not sabotaging them, not locking them, just logging off the way a shift change logs off, orderly, complete, leaving the machines running at their last calibrated state. Each engineer packed their physical tools into their standard kit: calibration gauges, manual tension wrenches, the small notched instruments that centuries of Valari technical doctrine had classified as primitive redundancies. The ones that human grid keepers had never stopped carrying, because the machines, their machines, the ones they'd spent 90 years building in the outer dark, had always needed hands on them. The Valari Technical Corps had automated their own infrastructure so thoroughly that no one in their hierarchy still understood what a manual calibration felt like. That was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of memory, and it had been building for 200 years. Lynn's people understood what they were leaving behind. That was why they took the gauges with them. By the 36th hour after the decree, the monitoring screens aboard the Valari Command Platform Vantage of Kull showed every human beacon in the 7th sector going dark in sequence, not all at once, but node by node, the way a grid powers down for a scheduled maintenance rotation. Steady, predictable, unhurried. The Valari technical director, a lean species senior named Orathvi, stood in front of the telemetry board and watched the last cluster of human beacons blink out over the deep fringe anchorages. She sent a standard data inquiry to the nearest transit node. The node returned a status ping: running, stable, all lanes nominal. Orathvi logged the human withdrawal as a formal relinquishment of operational authority, per the decree. She filed a request to have a Valari technical core team deployed to the primary node apex by the end of the standard week to begin a structured transition inventory. She marked the human sector routing keys as pending receipt. She poured herself a heated water bulb and did not think much more about it because the boards were still green, and green boards meant everything was fine. 72 hours into the silence, the boards were still green. She slept well. The Valari Technical Corps reached the primary node apex on the 4th day. 29 senior systems engineers, hand-selected from the sovereignty's top technical faculties, suited up and boarded the main platform with a full inventory of computational override hardware. The transit rings around them, massive iron and crystal structures 2 kilometers across, rotated slowly on their gyroscopic mounts, lit from within by the residual charge of the subatomic resonance field that the humans had been maintaining for 90 years. It looked, to every engineer on the team, exactly like machinery they understood. Their team lead, a meticulous senior named Chet-OS, pulled the quantum key package that the Assembly Directorate had catalogued from the human surrender of documentation. He ran a standard integration handshake with the node's computational layer. The node accepted it. Green. We are now the registered operators of Node Hub 1, ChetOS announced to his team. They began their inventory. What they did not know, what no one on the team had been briefed to look for, because it did not appear in any computational layer, any digital registry, or any code documentation that the humans had surrendered, was the subatomic resonance drift. The transit rings did not hold their geometry automatically. They held it because human hands had been making micro-adjustments, by gauge, by feel, by 90 years of accumulated physical intuition, every 4 to 6 hours without stopping. The nodes were not a machine you operated. They were a machine you continuously talked down from the edge. At hour 78, the first drift began. It was small, 7 nanometers of lateral displacement on the inner ring of node 3, in a section of the resonance geometry that no automated sensor was calibrated to flag, because the humans had always caught it before it reached the flagging threshold. On the Valari technical board, it did not register. In the deep structural lattice of the ring itself, it began to travel. Lynn was in her quarters on the Dauntless when Reyes put the first status report through. She was reading paper again, a technical manual for the subatomic dampener array they had never formally entered into any galactic registry, because it had never needed to be registered. It had only ever needed to work. Node 3 drift started, Reyes said through the door comm. How long to propagation? Lynn asked. Chetos's team won't see it for another 30 hours, maybe 40. Any sign they're looking for it. A pause. They ran a standard diagnostic loop, came back clean. Of course it did. Lynn turned a page. Keep the watch. She went back to reading. Outside the Dauntless, across the vast and now quiet 7th sector, 300,000 human engineers were in transit toward the deep fringe anchorages, carrying their gauges, waiting. The sector's transit rings glowed in the dark like lanterns left on after the keeper has gone home. The drift in Node 3 moved 3 more nanometers before the watch changed. On the 6th day, the lanes turned amber. Not all at once. That would have been easier to diagnose. It happened the way a bruise spreads, first one lane marker on the outer chart, deep in the 7th sector's trailing edge, then 3 more by morning watch, then a whole corridor of transit indicators shifting from the steady green of calibrated geometry to the flat, unhurried amber that every Valari navigator was trained to treat as a preliminary caution flag. HFY stood in front of her telemetry board and felt, for the first time, something she could not immediately classify. She pulled the raw sensor data. Node 3 showed a lateral ring displacement of 41 nanometers. That was not on any failure chart she had studied. The chart started at 100. She ran the standard diagnostic. Clean return. She ran it again. Same result. The diagnostic was looking for the wrong thing in the wrong layer, using thresholds calibrated for Valari-built infrastructure, and the transit rings were not Valari-built. She sent a query to ChetOS at the Apex node. His response took 4 hours. When it arrived, it said the team had identified an intermittent signal variance in the outer ring gyroscopic assembly and had applied a standard corrective power surge through the stabilizer banks. The lane indicators should normalize within 1 standard cycle. HFY stared at that sentence for a long time. A standard corrective power surge into a subatomic resonance field that had been held at its current geometry by continuous manual microadjustment for 90 years, by human hands, using notched iron gauges and a physical intuition that did not have a name in any Valari engineering text, because it did not need a name. It was just what you did when you worked on a machine that talked back. She sent ChetOS a follow-up query. She asked him to confirm the power surge had been applied at reduced amplitude with a manual harmonic check run before and after. His response took 6 hours that time. He said the team did not have the manual harmonic check equipment on site. He said he'd requisitioned a second computational override unit to augment the stabilizer output. Orathvi looked at the amber lane and said nothing. She pulled up the Human Engineering Registry, the one the Assembly Technical Directorate had received as part of the surrender documentation, and searched it for manual harmonic calibration protocol. The registry returned no results, because the humans had not written it down, not anywhere in the formal record, not because they were hiding it, simply because, for 90 years, it had lived in their hands. Clara Lynn received the telemetry feed on the Dauntless through a monitoring tap that Reyes had established on the Valari Command Network's open broadcast layer before the evacuation. It was not illegal. The Valari hadn't thought to restrict it, because restricting an open broadcast layer required first thinking that someone might be watching. Lynn sat at the duty table in the command bay and read the Amber Lane report with her coffee mug at her right elbow. A woman named Sergeant Ewo Vance, 26 years old, from a colony called Hatch Station on the outer rim of the 7th Sector. A woman who had spent 3 years doing manual resonance calibration at Node 3 before transferring to the Dauntless, was sitting across the table, running maintenance checks on her kit. "Node 3, Lynn said. Vance didn't look up from her gauge set. 41 nanometers when I left. If their surge hit it wrong, it'll be 60 by now. Can they stop it from here?" Vance set a wrench down and considered it with the patience of someone who has been asked a question they already know the answer to. Not without a hand on the inner ring, and not without knowing what 70 nanometers sounds like. "Sounds like," Lynn repeated. "You hear it through the hull," Vance said. "It's a specific pitch. Low, you feel it more than you hear it, actually." She picked the wrench back up. "We spent about 6 months learning it. It's not in any manual." Lynn nodded. She looked at the telemetry feed. The amber lanes were widening. 43 million people relied on those transit lanes for commercial freight alone. Colony supply runs, medical shipments, fuel transfer routes that connected 68 outer-rim stations to the core grid. Lynn had pulled that number from the freight registry before the evacuation. She had not put it in any briefing document. She knew it, the way you know the weight of a thing you've been carrying. The lanes would not go dark, not for any of those 68 stations. The safety lock was absolute. Life support networks ran on a separate, isolated grid that human engineers had partitioned off before the evacuation, hard-coded to continue running on its own stored charge for 14 months without a single calibration input. The humans had made sure of that before they left, because that was the line military and administrative infrastructure could decay, but no one's oxygen went out. But the freight lanes were going amber, and amber did not stay amber. At Node 8, on the 7th day, Chet OS made his second wrong decision. The lateral drift had reached 64 nanometers. His second computational override unit was online, and he ran a full-power corrective surge through both stabilizer banks simultaneously, a solution that would have been correct for any transit node in the standard Valari network, which ran on a completely different resonance principle and had been built by a species whose infrastructure had never needed to be continuously talked down from an edge. The surge hit the inner ring of Node 8's transit geometry at a moment when the drift had already moved the ring 32 thousandths of a degree off its load-bearing axis. The power flooded into a structure that was not where the power expected it to be. The transit geometry inverted. It did not explode. It did not collapse. What it did was far more precise and far more catastrophic. It locked. The quantum slip bridge that Node 8 had been maintaining across a 14-light-hour segment of the 7th Sector's primary commercial corridor simply froze at its current geometry and held there, stable as stone, utterly inert. 212 bulk freighters were in transit through that bridge at the moment of inversion. They stopped, not violently. The geometry held them perfectly suspended in the grey pocket between dimensions, pressurized, lit, life support functioning, engines running against a surface they could not move through. The crews were fine. They were simply not anywhere, in the physical sense, and they were not going to be anywhere until someone put a hand on the inner ring of Node 8 and walked the geometry back to its correct position. the nearest human engineer with the manual calibration experience to do that was currently on a transport hull 3 days out from the 7th sector fringe. The power surge from Node 8's inversion traveled back through the industrial grid before anyone on HFY's board could flag it. At Valari Prime, the grand shipyards drew their operational power from the same grid backbone that served the transit node network, a design decision made 6 decades ago for efficiency, before the grid had been human-calibrated to run at the precision tolerances the resonance geometry required. The back surge hit the shipyard power intake at twice the rated tolerance. The lights in the dry docks went out. Not a brief flicker. The entire power plant for the vaulted dry docks of Valari Prime, 47 active berths, 92 construction bays, a facility that was, at the moment of the surge, building 11 capital vessels for the sovereignty's next expansion cycle, dropped to zero and did not come back up. In the dark, the magnetic cradles holding a half-assembled capital hull in berth 7 failed. The hull, 600 meters long and not yet self-supporting, began to settle. Emergency structurals caught it before it fell. Just. The hull sat at a 7-degree list in the dark cradle while the backup generators struggled to their feet, and HFY's board, which had been amber for 3 days, turned the color of an open wound. Ziakul received the shipyard report 17 minutes after the surge. He read it standing at his window in the assembly spire, looking out at the star field over the dead moon's horizon. His crystalline skin, in the pressurized luxury atmosphere of the spire, had been sitting at a soft violet all week. It shifted toward obsidian now. His first response was not fear. It was fury, the clean, administrative fury of a person who has been handed a failure that should not have been possible. He pulled the human engineering file. He pulled the surrender documentation. He pulled every digital registry key that the Assembly Technical Directorate had received at the close of the decree session. He spent 2 hours going through it. Then he sent a direct transmission to Commander Lin's personal command frequency on the open galactic band, unencrypted, because he wanted her to know he was not hiding the contact. "Commander," Ziakul said. His translated voice was still quiet, still level, but it was the quiet of something clenching rather than the quiet of something at rest. The transit matrix is experiencing a series of harmonic irregularities that your documentation does not address. I require an explanation, and I require it promptly. Lin was in the dauntless command bay when the transmission came through. She was reading paper, duty roster, and she set it down without hurry when Reyes put the call on speaker. "Executor," she said, "what specific documentation are you missing?" The manual calibration protocols for the inner resonance rings, the subharmonic drift correction procedures, the load-bearing geometry adjustment sequences. A pause. His voice tightened almost imperceptibly. The entirety of what your engineers actually did to keep those nodes running. Lin picked up her coffee mug. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. "Executor," she said, "what you're describing is not documentation. It's experience. 90 years of it. It lives in the hands of 300,000 engineers who are currently in transit out of your jurisdiction under human law." She set the mug down. "You took the paperwork. The paperwork was always just the paperwork." Silence on the line, the kind of silence that has texture. "You are describing economic sabotage of galactic infrastructure," Ziakul said at last. "I'm describing a scheduled evacuation following a legal change of administrative authority," Lin said. "The grid is running exactly as it was when we left it. The physical laws haven't changed, Executor. You just inherited them." She cut the transmission. Reyes looked at her across the command bay. "He's going to move assets," Reyes said. "Yes," Lin said. "How long?" Lin unfolded her paper roster. "He needs to convene the assembly for a military authorization, and he'll want to be quiet about it. 4 days, maybe 5. She turned a page. Tell engineering I want the dampener array at full diagnostic readiness by tomorrow morning. Reyes nodded and turned to his board. Lynn went back to reading. Outside the Dauntless, in the deep quiet of the 7th Sector fringe, the amber lanes were widening into orange. At Node 8, 212 freighter crews sat in the grey pocket between dimensions and waited, their emergency beacons pinging into an empty sector that had no one listening at the relay stations anymore. The stations were still running, the power was on, the receivers were active, there was simply no one there to answer. On the 9th day, Sayakul transmitted a second message. This one did not go to Lynn's personal frequency. It went to every registered galactic broadcast channel simultaneously: assembly members, border authorities, shipping guilds, colonial registration bodies, military command nodes of 30 separate sovereign fleets. He called it an emergency declaration of logistical crisis. He described the transit matrix failure as an act of deliberate technological terrorism. He named Commander Clara Lynn by her full Terran Admiralty designation. He called for the immediate return of human engineering personnel under Assembly Emergency Authority, with a guarantee of safe passage and formal immunity from any civilian litigation arising from the infrastructure failure. He did not mention that humanity had left legally in response to a decree his own body had passed 4 days prior. The broadcast did not include that detail. Lynn read the full text on a printed transcript that Reyes handed her. She read it the way she read everything, start to finish, no skimming. "How many species picked this up?" she asked. "All 420 member bodies," Reyes said, "plus about 60 non-member observers." Lynn folded the transcript carefully. She set it beside her mug. She turned her silver ring around her thumb once, twice, and stopped. "He's frightened," she said, not with satisfaction, just as a reading. "The shipyards going dark scared him," Reyes said. "The freighters scared him more." Lynn looked at the live telemetry feed. The Node 8 status light was still the color of an open wound. 212 ships. She knew some of those crews by name, not all of them, but some. Colony families. Freight haulers who had been running those lanes for 20 years. They were warm and pressurized and entirely suspended, and they would stay that way until someone with the right hands went in and walked the geometry home. The dampener array was already running its diagnostics. That work would keep. But this, the freighters, the civilian supply chains thinning as the amber lanes spread, this was the part that had always been the hardest. Not the strategy. The waiting, while other people sat in the dark between dimensions, counting on the math being right. She pulled the duty log for Sergeant Vance and 3 other engineers who had served time at Node 8. She read their service records. She noted the entry on Vance. Calibrated inner ring Node 8 twice without supervisory guidance, March cycle, year 2187. Assessment, exceptional manual intuition. She set the log down. They know how to come home, she thought. Let it run a little further first. The telemetry pinged. A new amber flag, this time on the Node 12 corridor, a major freight trunk serving 11 outer colonies, none of them large enough to have emergency reserves past 30 days. Lynn looked at it for a moment. She looked at the Node 8 status. She looked at the Lane 12 flag. She picked up her pen and wrote 2 names on the paper roster. Outside, across the void, the dead transit rings rotated in their silent gyroscopic mounts and waited for hands that understood them. While the Valari sovereignty, 420 species of accumulated galactic authority, scrambled through documentation that had never contained the thing they needed, looking for an answer that was packed into an equipment case aboard a human transport hull 3 days from the fringe. Sitting in the hands of a woman who had logged off a workstation 9 days ago and had not yet decided whether to log back in. Lane 12 did not stabilize overnight. By the time Lynn's morning watch began on day 10, the amber had spread to 9 of the 12 trunk corridors serving the outer colonies. Not because the drift was accelerating. The drift was moving exactly as her engineers had calculated, the way a tide moves, unhurried, and indifferent to whoever is standing on the shore. The Valari Technical Corps had run 4 more corrective surges through the night, each one slightly larger than the last, each one landing on a ring geometry that was no longer where the surge expected it to be. Lynn received the updated map at her duty table with her coffee and her paper printout of overnight traffic. Ray's put the summary on a single sheet. She read it once. "They've been surging Node 5 since 300, Ray said. "I see it." She set the sheet down. "Get me Vance." Sergeant Vance appeared in the doorway of the command bay, still pulling her jacket straight. She was 26 years old and had the unhurried expression of someone who spent 3 years working alone on a node platform and learned not to waste energy on alarm. "Node 8, Lynn said. "If we send you back in now, how long to walk the geometry home?" Vance thought about it with the same patience she'd shown the day before. 6 hours to reach the ring, 4 hours of manual work if the drift hasn't compounded, then the freighters move. She paused. If it's compounded longer. What's the compounding risk? Every surge they've run since the inversion has been pushing geometry that's already off axis. Could be 8 hours of work. Could be 12. Lynn nodded once. She looked at the map, the 9 amber corridors, the 11 colonies with supply chains thinning, the 212 crews still suspended in the grey pocket at Node 8. She looked at the Lane 12 indicator for a long moment. "You leave at 600, Lynn said. "Take Kemp, Doris, and whoever you want from the Node 3 roster. Manual kit only, no computational override hardware." She looked up. "Nobody is to touch the stabilizer banks on 8 until you've had your hands on the inner ring." "Clear." "Clear," Vance said. She left. Lynn unfolded her paper printout and went back to reading. Outside, across the 7th sector, the amber lanes held their color and the rings kept turning. Ziakul received the overnight damage assessment at the assembly spire before his first formal session of the day. He read it standing, the way he always processed urgent material, still, formal, weight distributed forward on the balls of his feet. His crystalline skin sat deep obsidian in the morning cycle's atmospheric pressure. 9 trunk corridors, 47 colonies affected by freight delay, 212 vessels still suspended, the Valari dry docks still running on backup power, the half-assembled capital hull in berth 7 still listed at its 7-degree angle because the magnetic cradles had not been rated for extended emergency load. He had been certain, the morning after the decree, that humanity's evacuation was a negotiating gesture, a dramatic withdrawal designed to create leverage for a counter-proposal. Every political model his advisors ran had produced the same output. The Terran Compact, scattered across deep space outposts without centralized trade authority approval, would return to the table within 72 hours. The models had been built on the assumption that humanity needed the assembly the way every other species needed it, for recognition, for legal standing, for access to the core trade lanes that the sovereignty controlled. The models had been wrong. He sent the military authorization request to the assembly floor at 800 standard. He did not call it a military action. He called it a logistical emergency response, a deployment of sovereignty assets to secure the central database vaults at the frontier anchorage of the 7th sector, for the purpose of recovering the full calibration documentation that the Terran Compact had failed to provide at the time of the administrative transfer. It was approved in 4 hours by 398 votes. 22 species abstained. Nobody voted against it. Nobody in the chamber asked what the calibration documentation actually was, or why it hadn't been in the surrender file, or what surging a resonance ring with a computational override unit did to a geometry that was already 64 nanometers off its load-bearing axis. Ziakul watched the vote total reach its threshold and felt something settle back toward violet in his skin. He had 70 capital vessels under Admiral Retvars, his best heavy fleet commander, a decorated veteran of 3 sovereignty expansion campaigns. Retvars would reach the frontier anchorage in 36 hours. The data vaults would be secured. The calibration data would be extracted. He did not know what calibration data he was looking for. He assumed it was there, in a vault, in a format that could be extracted, because that was how data worked. It was stored, it was retrievable, it was subject to administrative transfer. That was the mirror fallacy, running clean and unexamined at the center of every decision he had made in the last 10 days. He looked at every problem through the lens of how his own civilization worked, and his civilization had never built a machine that needed to be talked down from an edge by human hands. He did not know that yet. Sergeant Vance reached Node 8 at 14:30 on day 11. The node platform was intact, still fully pressurized, still lit by the residual field charge. The Valari technical core team was gone. Chet OS had pulled his people back to the Apex hub after the fourth failed surge to avoid further compounding. The platform was empty and humming. Vance suited up with Kemp and Doris and two engineers from the Node 3 roster, and they went through the airlock into the maintenance access corridor that ran the inner circumference of the transit ring. The ring was warm. Not hot, warm, the way a machine is warm when it has been working hard without maintenance. Vance laid one hand flat on the inner hull and closed her eyes. She listened. Kemp watched her and said nothing. He had worked with her long enough to know what she was doing. Doris, who had come up from Node 3 and had not served with Vance before, opened his mouth to say something useful and then closed it when Kemp looked at him. 214 nanometers, Vance said. Her eyes were still closed. Maybe 220. The surges compounded. Kemp looked at his gauge. You're close, 218. Vance opened her eyes and pulled the notched iron tool from her kit. The same pattern as Lynn's gauge. Different tool. Same hand-filed calibration marks scratched into the edge by a human who had learned what 218 felt like before they had the equipment to measure it. She found the first adjustment point and went to work. It took 9 hours and 40 minutes. Not 12. She was good. When she walked the geometry home, the transit ring finding its correct position with a low, satisfied resonance that ran through the hull and up through Vance's boots and into her legs, the grey pocket that had been holding 212 freight crews for 4 days simply released. On Orathvi's board, the Node 8 status light turned green. 212 vessels emerged from the transit corridor into open space, right on the 7th sector trunk lane, engines running, cargo intact, crews exactly as healthy as they'd been when the geometry locked. The captains of those ships reported their status to the sector relay, which was staffed now by a small human crew that Lynn had quietly repositioned to the relay station the night before, and got a clean all clear in return. One of those captains, a colony freight hauler named Burrs Akkad, had been running Lane 8 for 19 years. He came out of the grey pocket into open space, ran his status checks, confirmed his cargo was sound, and sat in his command chair for a full minute without saying anything. Then he keyed the relay. "Relay Station 7, this is Hatch's promise," he said. 4 days in the grey, what do we owe you?" The relay operator on the human end of that transmission was a young woman who had been on shift for 6 hours and who said, in a voice that gave nothing away, "Keep flying, Captain. Lane's clear." Burrs Akkad noted it in his log and set his course for the outer colony. He did not know who had put hands on the ring at Node 8. He would find out later, and he would remember the name. Lynn got the Node 8 green at 2300 hours. She was already asleep by then, 4 hours of scheduled rest, which Reyes had enforced with the quiet ruthlessness of a crew that knew their commander needed to be sharp for what was coming. He left the green status ping on her printout for the morning. What he did not leave on the printout, what he held until she was at the duty table with her coffee and her eyes clear, was the fleet telemetry he'd picked up at 200 through the open broadcast layer. 70 capital vessels, formation transit, bearing directly for the frontier anchorage of the 7th sector. Estimated arrival, 14 hours. Lynn read it. She set her coffee down. She looked at the telemetry for a long moment, tracking the formation spread, the vessel class profiles, the drive signatures that Rays had pulled through the monitoring tap. "Fleet composition," she asked. "Heavy cruisers mostly, 13 battle line vessels. The rest are escorts and support." Rays paused. "Admiral Retvars commanding." Lynn nodded slowly. She picked her coffee back up, put the Dauntless on approach vector for the anchorage, slow, standard transit speed, and get me the 12 interdiction platforms. Rays looked at her. "All 12. All 12. She unfolded her paper printout, not the fleet telemetry, the duty roster, and drew a small bracket around two names she had written there 2 days ago. Vance's name was already crossed off. The second name was a systems engineer named Peter Gantz, 41 years old, who had spent 8 years calibrating the subatomic thermal dampener array before it had been installed at the Frontier anchorage, and who was currently aboard a transport hull 6 hours out from the fringe. Lynn drew an arrow from his name to the edge of the page and wrote one word: ready. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing the deployment order for the dampener array. Not on a slate, not in the digital command system. On paper, which could not be remotely accessed, remotely deleted, or intercepted by any monitoring layer that the Valari ran on the open broadcast network. She wrote in plain, even block letters, the kind of handwriting that means the person doing it has been thinking about this for a long time. Admiral Retvars brought his fleet out of transit at the Frontier anchorage at 1600 hours on day 13, right on his estimated schedule. He was a careful commander, decorated, methodical, experienced in the kind of precision deployment that sovereignty expansion campaigns demanded. He ran his formation spread wide, gave his escort wings good separation, and approached the anchorage on a standard interdiction vector that covered every documented exit lane from the facility. He had been briefed that he would encounter no military resistance. The human forces in the 7th Sector had no combat fleet, only a single vessel, the UNS Dauntless, which was a frontier command ship, lightly armed, not a warship by any sovereign metric the Valari military used. The Dauntless was there when he arrived. It was sitting 12,000 kilometers off the anchorage's main data vault access corridor, on a heading that suggested it had been waiting. Behind it were 12 flat, dark platforms that were not in any Valari military registry Retvars had access to. He hailed the Dauntless on the standard military frequency. "Commander Lin," he said. His voice was professional, unhurried, the voice of a senior officer delivering terms he considered settled. "You are in a restricted approach corridor under an active sovereignty security authorization. Please stand clear of the Frontier anchorage access lanes and allow my vessels to proceed. We have no orders to engage your ship." Lynn's voice came back clean through the comms. No static, no signal compression. Just her voice, the same level it always was. "Admiral Retvars," she said, "I understand your orders. I want to make sure you understand your situation before you proceed." A pause. "Proceed, Commander." "Your fleet is currently within the operational field of a subatomic thermal dampener array," Lynn said. "It's been installed at this anchorage for 4 years. I'll be honest with you, there's nothing in the Valari military registry about it because it was never a weapon. We built it to protect the resonance geometry during maintenance cycles. We just never removed it." Another pause, longer this time. "Commander," Retvar said, "you're advising me that you have a weapons system in range of my fleet." "I'm advising you that you're in the operational field of an array that was built for maintenance purposes," Lynn said. "I'm telling you this because I'd rather you understand the situation clearly and make an informed decision than have you find out the other way." Retvars cut his comms and checked his sensor array. His sensor team ran a full active scan of the 12 platforms. The platforms returned no weapons signatures, no charged systems, no targeting locks, no drive emissions. They looked like maintenance equipment, flat and dark and entirely inert. He spent 4 minutes reviewing the scan results. Then he transmitted his fleet to advance on the anchorage. Lynn watched the formation move on a telemetry display. She watched the lead vessels cross the 14,000-kilometer mark. She watched the escort wings come into position. She picked up her coffee mug. It was empty. She set it back down. "Gantz," she said into the command bay comms. Peter Gantz's voice came back from the dampener control station, 6 decks below the bridge. He had been at that station for 3 hours and 20 minutes. "Ready on your word, Commander." Lin watched the lead vessels cross 12,000 kilometers. 11. She watched Retvaz's flagship settle into the center of the formation, the way a careful commander always does, giving himself maximum options. "Gantz," she said, "activate the array." He did. The subatomic thermal dampening field spread from the 12 platforms in the same quiet way that a resonance field always spread. Not a flash, not a visible wave, not anything that looked like a weapon going off. It was simply a change in the local subatomic state of a region of space, precise and clean and absolute, covering every vessel in Retvaz's formation simultaneously. Inside those vessels, the power cores, which ran on a quantum thermal reaction cycle, the same cycle every capital ship in the known galaxy ran on, began to lose their thermal differential. Not catastrophically, not violently. The differential dropped at a rate that felt, to the engineering crews monitoring their core readouts, like an unusual but not alarming gradient shift, until the gradient reached the minimum operational threshold, and the cores dropped to standby, and the drives went cold, and the weapons systems powered down in the automatic sequence that every safety protocol demanded when a core reached standby, and the flagship's navigation display went dark. And Admiral Retvaz was sitting in a command chair in a ship that was perfectly intact, perfectly pressurized, perfectly warm, and incapable of moving. 11 minutes from activation to full stillness across the entire formation. 70 capital vessels hanging against the stars. Shields collapsed to static. Main batteries frozen mid-rotation. Drives cold. All of them in every berth and formation slot, without a single hull breach, without a single life lost, without a single weapon fired. The galaxy, watching on the open broadcast network that Sayakul had used to announce his emergency declaration 3 days prior, saw the telemetry feed from Retvaz's own fleet, the formation's automatic distress broadcast, which had activated when the cores hit standby, and saw the formation status lights go grey, one by one, in a sequence as unhurried and deliberate as amber lanes spreading across a transit map. No human officer spoke on the military channel. No transmission went out from the Dauntless. The silence said everything the silence always said. On the assembly spire, Executor Ziakul received the distress broadcast from Retvaz's flagship at 16:41 hours, 25 minutes after the array activated, 11 minutes into the stillness. The flagship's automatic status transmission was a standard military distress format: vessel ID, formation position, core status, and one line of free text from the commanding officer. Retvaz had filed it manually, which meant he had enough power for ship systems, but had chosen not to use the comms array, either because he didn't want to be heard or because he was being careful about what he said on an open channel. The free text line read, "Array activation confirmed. Fleet fully immobilized. No casualties. No hull breaches. Recommend immediate diplomatic contact with Commander Lin." Sayakul read that line standing at his window again, looking at the same star field over the dead moon's horizon he had been looking at on the day the shipyard went dark. His crystalline skin was deep obsidian now, deeper than it had been since the decree session, and it did not shift. He had sent his best fleet commander. He had sent 70 capital vessels. He had sent them to secure a data vault that contained, it was now clear, nothing that would solve his problem. Because the problem was not in a vault, the problem was in the hands of 300,000 people who had packed their tools and left, and the tools they had taken were not in any registry he had searched, and the problem was not documentation, and the problem was not the machines. The problem was that he had mistaken a willingness to sign for a need to stay. His comms staff were waiting for his instruction. The assembly floor was waiting for a status briefing. 419 member species were watching the distress beacon broadcast on the open network and doing, very quietly, the same arithmetic he was doing. Sayakul looked at the telemetry feed from the frontier, 70 grey status lights, steady and still, and understood, for the first time since the decree, that the situation had moved into a register that no administrative action could reach. He turned from the window. "Get me Commander Lin," he said. The call came through at 17:03 hours. Lin let it wait 17 seconds. She was finishing a line on the deployment order, the one clearing human maintenance teams back to nodes 3, 5, and 12. She finished the sentence, set her pen down, and opened the channel. "Commander Lin." Sayakul's voice carried the same soft, pressurized tenor it always did, but something beneath it had changed. The quiet was clenched now, not still. "I would like to discuss a resolution to the current situation." "All right," Lin said. A pause. He had expected an opening demand, a number, a list of conditions. "I am prepared to discuss revised administrative terms for the transit network, partnership arrangements that better reflect." "Executor." She picked up her empty coffee mug and set it back down. "We're not renegotiating the partnership. There is no partnership. What I'm willing to discuss is the new arrangement. Humanity owns the space within 3 parsecs of every gate ring in the 7th sector. Approach without manual clearance and your ships drift. That's already in the assembly registry. It becomes effective when you sign it." Silence, not the silence of thinking. The silence of a person who heard the sentence coming and hoped, until this moment, that it wouldn't. "That is a territorial claim without precedent," he said. "I know," Lin said. "We drafted it last week. And in return, you restore the network." "We resume maintenance. The network restores itself when the hands go back on the rings." She paused. "Your dry dock in berth 7 can't wait for a floor vote, Executor. 6 weeks is too long." Another silence, longer. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow, first session." She closed the channel. Rays looked at her across the command bay. She picked up her pen and finished the deployment order. "Find someone to get me a full cup of coffee," she said. The morning of the chamber session, Lin came to the Obsidian concourse alone. No aide, no second seat. She wore the same jacket she had worn to the decree session 14 days ago. She walked through the high side doors at the formal hour and crossed to the central podium without looking at the 419 delegations arranged in their concentric arcs of volcanic glass. The obsidian surface was empty, cleared and clean. She stood at the podium and looked at Executor Sayakul at the high dais, his skeletal fingers flat on the speaking rail, his crystalline skin sitting at a deep, still obsidian. "Executor," she said, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." He made a quiet signal to the aide at his left. The aide returned, carrying a sealed administrative case. He opened it on the lower table. Inside, in the cataloging foam, was the iron gauge, scratched edge up, the hand-filed calibration mark catching the chamber light. Lin walked to the lower table and picked it up. It was cold, the cold of iron that has sat in a climate-controlled case for 2 weeks without a hand on it. She felt the weight settle into her palm. She set it on the podium, not to leave it, just to put it down while she reached into her jacket and pulled out the Maritime Exclusion Charter, 3 pages, printed on paper, folded once. She unfolded it and placed it on the obsidian surface beside the gauge. The chamber held its breath. "The 7th Sector Maritime Exclusion Zone," Lin said. 3 parsecs around every gate ring. Human law is absolute inside that perimeter. Ships that enter without manual clearance are rendered inert by the grid itself. No enforcement action required. The physical reality of the system handles it." She looked at Sayakul. "Your signature initiates human maintenance resumption. Your fleet is released the moment a human team clears Node 5. Sayakul descended from the high dais. He crossed the chamber floor slowly. Every step was the step of a being who had administered the largest sovereignty in the known galaxy for 30 years, walking toward a document he had not written and could not change. 419 delegations watched him cross and said nothing. He reached the podium. He looked at the charter. He looked at the gauge beside it. The grid didn't break because of a war, Speaker, Lynn said. It just stopped answering to people who forgot that the machine runs on grit, not decrees. She held a pen out to him, plain, black. Sayakul took it. His hand was not steady. He did not try to make it steady. He turned to the third page and signed. Lynn picked up the charter and folded it once. She put it in her jacket pocket. She picked up the iron gauge, warm now, from her palm and held it at her side. "You mistook our willingness to sign your registries for a need to live in your shadow," she said. "Flat, factual, the way you read a tension measurement off a gauge. We spent a century learning your grammar just to tell you no in a way you couldn't translate." She turned and walked toward the high side doors. The chamber stayed silent behind her. Not the silence of shock, the arithmetic silence. 419 species recalculating simultaneously, running the same figures against every arrangement they had built on the old assumptions about humanity. At the rear of the lowest tier, one delegation's recorder opened the formal session log and entered the date, participants, and charter terms. The taxonomy field required a classification drawn from 600 years of assembly procedure. There was no category that fit. The recorder left the field blank. It was the first blank field in the assembly's formal log in 600 years. The names went in on the third day. Not in the assembly record. In titanium, etched directly into the base plates of the main core gates. Every human crew that had worked the frontier outposts during the early Outer Rim quarantine blackout, before there were hands trained to keep the lanes open, before anyone in the assembly had known or cared what building a network in the outer dark actually cost. Lynn was at Node 5 when the etching happened. She had her hand on the inner ring of the maintenance corridor, feeling for the pitch that told her where the drift had settled after the Valari surge attempts. The ring was warm and slightly off, not badly, not past correction. She found the adjustment point and worked it back. When the ring reached its correct geometry, it made the low, satisfied sound she had first heard 30 years ago on a platform in the outer dark. She stood there and listened to it. Outside the node, across 3 parsecs of space running on human parameters, the amber lanes turned green, not all at once. Node by node, the same steady progression as before, tide going the other way. Back at the frontier anchorage, Lynn set the iron gauge on her desk, scratched edge up, the calibration mark in the light. She set the folded charter beside it. 3 processing requests from sovereignty member species were waiting in her incoming file fringe bodies that had watched Retvaz's fleet go grey and done their arithmetic fast. She read each one. She filed them without responding. There would be time. She pulled Vance's Node 8 report. At the bottom, in handwriting, ring sounds right. Lynn set the report down. She picked up her coffee. She drank it while it was still hot. The gate rings of the 7th sector turned in their mounts outside, steady and calibrated, their lanes the even green of a machine that had been spoken to properly. The charter sat folded on the desk. The processing requests sat in the file. The iron gauge caught the light with its scratched edge up. Nobody was watching it.